So this is the second part of the lecture for the biogeochemical cycle PowerPoint. So in the previous recording, I talked about the introduction to these cycles and the water cycle. In this recording, I will discuss the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So just to review, water is a molecule. It has two or more atoms, two hydrogens and an oxygen atom. Now, carbon is an element. It is a single atom, and nitrogen is an element. So let's look at your learning objectives for the carbon cycle. You need to explain how fossil fuels are formed. And then you need to be able to discuss long-term and short-term carbon cycling and how those two processes are interconnected. Finally, I want you to choose two human activities and explain how they affect the carbon cycle. Okay, so I will start with basic information. Carbon is essential for all living organisms, right? We have carbon that makes up all different kinds of molecules in our body. So 18% of your body contains molecules with carbon atoms. In fact, when we talk about organic molecules, that means they have carbon. If you ever take organic chemistry, which I took, and I mean, I kind of liked chemistry, but OChem was like, that was hard stuff. But anyway, organic chemicals or organic molecules all have carbon. Now, fossil fuels are made of carbon. Now, I put oil in parentheses here, but fossil fuels also include like natural gas and coal. Carbon dioxide, which is a carbon and two oxygen molecules, is present in the atmosphere. So I talked a little bit about global warming. That is occurring because of an excess amount, one of the reasons I should say, an excess amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. But remember that carbon dioxide is also absorbed by photosynthetic organisms. So just a side note, referring back to that lecture, remember that photosynthetic organisms include plants, few bacteria, algae, and basically they take in sunlight as a form of energy, carbon dioxide and water. With those inputs, they make sugar, which is just a ton of carbons, and oxygen, which we need to breathe, and you all know that. Now, a small amount of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere through cellular respiration, and we talked about that in the previous lecture as well. We all take in food, right? We're heterotrophs. We have to eat other organisms to survive, whereas things that conduct photosynthesis are autotrophs. Okay, so we take in food, and inside our cells, that food is used to make an energy form that our cells can use. And we need this energy to grow, to reproduce, to repair tissue damage, all kinds of things. So we use that food, we make the energy, but we also make carbon dioxide through that process. We use oxygen and we make carbon dioxide as what we call a byproduct, and that's what we breathe out. So that goes into the atmosphere. The formation of rocks and fossil fuels remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But burning fossil fuels and deforestation, or cutting down the forest, puts that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So let's bring that all together and look at this cycle. And this is a video I want you to watch about the formation of fossil fuels. And that is one of your learning objectives, is to understand how fossil fuels are formed. So I'm not going to go into that very much. Just go back and watch the video. Okay, so I mentioned short-term and long-term carbon cycling. So those are two different cycles within the overall carbon cycle. So rapid cycling refers to like an exchange between organisms, whereas long-term cycling is through geologic processes like the formation of fossil fuels. And long-term just means like the carbon stays there for a long time, whereas rapid, the carbon atoms are going from organism to organism relatively quickly. Okay, so the question I wrote for you is, in what form is carbon found in the atmosphere? So we already went through that. It is found as carbon dioxide, sorry, I have a little bug flying in front of me, a carbon and two oxygen atoms. Now remember that carbon dioxide is absorbed by autotrophs, photosynthetic organisms, and that is part of short-term cycling. Photosynthesis removes that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and along with water and energy from the sun, it is used to make sugar and oxygen. Remember, autotrophs are also called producers, and they are the bottom of like our trophic level, right? Without producers, the ecosystems could not function. Now, heterotrophs feed on plants or on animals that feed on plants, right? So when, say, an herbivore eats a plant, it is taking the carbon in the plant tissues and it's now in its own body, right? So that carbon is going from plant to the organism that eats the plant. That is part of carbon cycling. Okay, so remember, a cycle, biogeochemical cycle, looks at how an element or molecule flows through the system, through different organisms, and through different abiotic elements of the ecosystem. So I asked you a question here: which process found in organisms returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere? So we went over that in the previous slide, you should remember, but just in case, it is cellular respiration. Hold on one second, I'll put that where you can see it. There you go, cellular respiration. So just to review cellular respiration, you eat food, you bring in oxygen, your cells use that to make cellular energy with CO2 as a byproduct, and you breathe out carbon dioxide and put it back into the atmosphere. Okay, so when I'm talking about carbon cycling, there are several things that humans do to impact the carbon cycle. Burning of fossil fuels, right? We use coal for energy, we use oil to power automobiles. Also, automobile exhaust has a lot of carbon dioxide in it as well. Now, I put how do the human impacts listed above affect the carbon cycle, and that is one of your learning objectives. So all of these three actions or impacts that I listed release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, deforestation, you're releasing the carbon that's stored in plant tissues, but you're also removing plants that could be taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that's like doubly bad. Now let's look at long-term cycling. So there are two ways that carbon is stored. Now, first of all, when an organism dies, animals, plants, whatever, decomposers break down the tissue from the dead organism and return it to the soil. Decomposers are things like bacteria or fungi, things like that. So now once the material is broken down, it's in the soil, you have layers and layers of soil that come over that, and a lot of pressure causes the formation of fossil fuels, right? Coal, oil, natural gas, whatever. And so that's why, like, we drill for oil or we fracture rocks to get natural gas, because all of these fossil fuels are very deep in the Earth's surface. You needed all of the rock and soil to press it down to form these fossil fuels. Now, carbon is also stored in the ocean. And this is what we call a sink, right? Carbon is stored there. A huge amount of carbon is stored in the ocean. Now, a couple things happen here. When carbon dioxide enters water, it forms carbonic acid. And that increases, obviously, the acidity of the ocean, which is affecting like coral reefs, things like that. But the other thing is when carbon dioxide enters the ocean, eventually it forms what's called calcium carbonate, which creates the shells of marine organisms. So we do need carbon dioxide in the ocean, but too much is a bad thing. And we do need carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, just not as much as we have now. So before I go on to the nitrogen cycle, let's do a little review of the learning objectives. There they are. Okay, explain how fossil fuels are formed, watch the video, but basically it's referring to the fact that dead organisms, plants, animals, they get broken down, it enters into the soil, many, many layers form, compresses it with high pressure, and that forms fossil fuels. Long-term and short-term carbon cycling. Short-term refers to like carbon dioxide entering autotrophs during photosynthesis. Organisms eat plants, so the carbon passes into their body, right? And then some CO2 enters the atmosphere through respiration. Long-term cycling refers to geologic processes like the formation of fossil fuels and also the storage of carbon dioxide in the ocean. Choose 2 human actions, explain how they affect the carbon cycle. Well, I gave you automobile exhaust, deforestation, and the burning of fossil fuels. All of those add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Okay, let's go to the nitrogen cycle. So for the nitrogen cycle, you need to explain how atmospheric nitrogen, or nitrogen in the air, enters the soil and how it is released back into the atmosphere. And then I want you to choose 2 human activities and explain how they affect the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, just like carbon and water, is essential for life, right? It's in all living organisms. It's actually a major part of DNA molecules. And as you should know, DNA is like your genetic information that programs everything in your body. It's present in the atmosphere as 2 nitrogen atoms bonded together, N2. Right, so nitrogen is actually a major component of our atmosphere. It's necessary for plants to grow. And actually, a lot of times in areas where a lot of crops are grown, there's not enough nitrogen. It gets depleted. Okay, so again, this is the picture from the Khan Academy readings. And like I said before, with the water cycle, things like that, you don't have to know every detail. Just use the picture to reinforce what I'm telling you and what's on the slide. So the important part of the nitrogen cycle is that it involves bacteria, soil bacteria. Now the soil contains tons of bacteria, all different kinds of bacteria, so many species. I don't even think we've counted a fraction of them. So nitrogen, I told you N2, two nitrogen atoms, makes up 78% of our atmosphere, right? We picture like the air as being mostly oxygen, but that's not true. It's actually a huge amount of nitrogen. Now, the nitrogen has to go from the air into the soil so that it can be used by plants. Bacteria are what take nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil in a form that plants can use. So this is called nitrogen fixation, and you need to know that term. So bacteria remove nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available to plants. So they take N2 and they turn it into a molecule called ammonia, NH3. Ammonia can be used by plants. Now in my picture here, it says nitrifying prokaryotes. That means bacteria, right? A bacteria is a type of prokaryote. So let me write this down because I know this involves terms that you're probably not familiar with. So nitrifying prokaryotes. So that refers to bacteria that take nitrogen from the atmosphere and change it into a form plants can use, which is pretty much what it says on my slide, but just to make sure you understand the terms. Nitrifying prokaryotes just refers to bacteria that do nitrogen fixation. Okay. Now, like I told you, nitrogen is a really important atom or element in DNA. Also, a ton of proteins. And proteins pretty much make your body function. So animals obtain nitrogen by eating plants or by eating animals that eat plants, right? So as you can probably tell by learning about all of this, plants are super important. So nitrogen, okay, goes from soil to plant. We eat the plant. Now nitrogen is in our body. So how does it get back into the soil? Well, when animals and plants die and decay, that means decomposers break down the tissues, it puts the nitrogen back in the soil. Also, there's nitrogen in urea, which is in your urine. Now, once the nitrogen is in the soil, it can go back into the atmosphere by what are called denitrifying bacteria. So remember, we have bacteria that takes it from the atmosphere and puts it in the soil, but there are also bacteria that takes soil nitrogen and put it back into the atmosphere. That's why I said that the nitrogen cycle is totally dependent on bacteria. Now, let's talk about human activities that affect the nitrogen cycle. So combustion of fossil fuels, combustion means to like burn, right? Or yeah, pretty much you can just think of it that way. So combustion of fossil fuels, like using coal for energy, things like that, releases what are called nitrogen oxides Nitrogen and oxygen put together releases those into the atmosphere. Also, remember that I told you nitrogen is limited in the soil. So if you grow crops over year after year after year, it takes all of that nitrogen out of the soil. So our fertilizers are made of like ammonia, which remember that has nitrogen in it. So our fertilizers contain nitrogen. So how does that affect the nitrogen cycle? Well, I put a picture here with all that green slimy stuff in the water. So basically, nitrogen fertilizers, when we irrigate our crops, the fertilizers run into the waterways. And that's like giving algae and other things in the water fertilizer. So then you get these huge blooms of like green slimy algae. Remember, algae is not a plant, but it looks like a plant. So nitrogen fertilizers cause, we call it algal growth, or the growth of algae in our waterways. Now, the combustion of fossil fuels puts nitrogen into the atmosphere, which is a major source of pollution, smog. So let me write that down for you here. I'm going to write, okay, so right under here, I'm going to put the effects of fertilizers. Waterways means like ponds, rivers, all that kind of stuff. Let's see here. Combustion of fossil fuels. Let me make that so you can see it. Oh. Hold on 1 second here. I'm having, there we go. There we go. Now you can see my typed out part. Okay, so those are the two effects of nitrogen, of human activities on the nitrogen cycle, right? So nitrogen fertilizers, we're adding a lot of nitrogen to the cycle. It's running off into our waterways, and that's like food for algae. Combustion of fossil fuels, and also car exhaust puts a lot of nitrogen into the atmosphere, which forms like smog. Okay. That is the last slide. So just to review what you've learned through this whole PowerPoint, we did an introduction to biogeochemical cycles. So you need to know the definition of what a biogeochemical cycle is. I also wanted you to know the difference between, say, an element and a compound or molecule. You just call it a molecule. Then you learned about the water cycle. So you had to know a variety of terms and how these processes relate to each other, like evaporation, condensation, you're forming a cloud, precipitation, rain or snow falls to the earth. You also need to know the term transpiration. That's how water goes through a plant and is released into the atmosphere as water vapor. You learned about the carbon cycle. You need to know about short-term versus long-term cycling. Remember, autotrophs take in carbon dioxide. Everything breathes out carbon dioxide as a byproduct of respiration. That's all short-term cycling. Long-term refers to storage as a fossil fuel or in the ocean. And then the nitrogen cycle, I want you to know that it all depends on bacteria. Bacteria take nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a molecule plants can use. When that nitrogen returns back to the soil, as plants and animals decay, bacteria take that nitrogen and put it back into the atmosphere. Okay, so, you also have to know the human activities and what they do to the nitrogen cycle.